Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios, welcome to this midweek edition of the Watchdog. My name is William Vogo, and on the show this evening,
if members of the executive don't respond to questions,
Deputy President Paul Mashatile evades the question of whether or not Eskom was instructed to keep the lights on this past weekend ahead of the EFF shutdown. Mashatile's maiden National Assembly question and answer session is the subject of tonight's panel discussion.
The national shutdown, which arose as a result of the continued misgovernance in South Africa, high levels of unemployment, crime, gender-based violence, and lack of service delivery, was a success.
We also look at EFF leader Julius Malema's own assessment of their Monday shutdown, which the Red Berets leader presented at a media briefing earlier today. All that and more in tonight's episode of the Watchdog, which starts right now. Pala, ministers who evade accountability, Eskom, local government woes, only some of the issues newly appointed Deputy President Paul Mashatile had to deal with today during his first question and answer session in Parliament. He dismissed allegations made by some of the opposition parties that the ruling party is using its majority to sweep the Pala saga under the carpet. This follows the defeat of a motion by the DA to establish an ad hoc committee to probe President Cyril Ramaphosa's Pala farm burglary and theft of money. He also committed himself to crack the whip on ministers who neglect their parliamentary obligations.
Mashatile's maiden oral session was delayed by almost an hour due to a light spark at the Good Hope Chamber. Parliament says the spark did not cause fire and posed no danger to occupants.
The capacitor in a light overheated, affecting the light cover, which consequently caused the smoke in office number 31. As a result, the smoke detector was triggered, further triggering the fire alarm system. I'm informed that there was no further damage as a result of this.
That aside, MPs started firing questions at Mashatile on the way Parliament is handling the Pala matter.
In the long term, what do you think will be the impact of the ruling party using its majority to circumvent parliamentary accountability? Do you support the fact that a mere majority can undermine findings of a credible independent panel led by a former Chief Justice?
Every attempt to have Parliament conduct its constitutional obligation has been blocked by your party, rendering Parliament toothless because of the ANC's majority and commitment to shielding the President.
Mashatile says there are a number of investigations underway on this matter, and that the various institutions probing it must be allowed to do their job.
so there is no shielding. I think sometimes there's a zeal to find the president guilty without going through due processes. It's not correct. We are a democracy. We have institutions that we have set up independent. Nobody's interfering with them. Let's not be impatient.
The Deputy President also made an undertaking to rein in errant ministers who fail to appear or answer parliamentary questions.
There will be consequences if members of the executive don't respond to questions. Obviously, the Speaker has powers to reprimand members who don't comply. And I think the Speaker did it recently. I know that other members felt that was harsh, but it had to be done.
He also took a swipe at the DA for criticizing the ANC, while they also use their majority to push through certain decisions where they govern. Mashatile was also questioned about the impact of load shedding on hospitals, as only a handful are exempted. He says government is concerned but cannot make a commitment about compensation.
Is the government considering to compensate families who are affected by death as a result of load shedding?
So I'm just saying we just need to be careful not to open a can of worms. There are many people affected, and in fact, government may not afford to be able to compensate everybody who's affected one way or the other by load shedding.
Mashatile says debt relief strategy is needed to deal with the debt owed by municipalities to Eskom. Lula Mamatya, SABC News, Parliament.
To discuss Deputy President Mashatile's maiden National Assembly question and answer session, please welcome our panel for this evening, Professor Beki Mngomezulu and Thapelo Tselapedi. Good evening to both of you. Thanks very much for your time.
Good evening to you, Vuyo, and good evening to my colleague.
Well, your thoughts on how the Deputy President handled his very first Q&A, Prof?
Thanks, Vuyo. I think that the Deputy President tried to be calm, but then obviously he evaded a number of questions, and some of the answers were anticipated. We knew how he was going to respond to some of those questions, including, for instance, the issue of load shedding, the issue of Phala, and then as it pertains to the president. So some of the answers, in fact, could be easily predicted. But I would say that under the circumstances, and given the fact that the Deputy President was occupying this position for the very first time, I would say he did well as far as he's concerned. But as far as some of us were observing, and then as far as those who were asking questions, especially from the opposition benches, were concerned, then of course there are a number of issues that we can debate until tomorrow morning.
For you, Dr. Tselapedi?
Well, I mean, we know Mr. Paul Mashatile is a person who is quite careful about the use of words, making sure that what he says is reflective of everybody's interest. We've seen that at the elective conference in December, at least also with events leading to that conference, given how he positioned himself between the sort of KZN and the Gauteng slates. So I think he's just brought on that same persona into the deputy presidency, into that post, of making sure that he speaks in a measured way and make sure that, you know, government programs are aligned to what he's saying. So I think it was obviously a decent sort of take in terms of his first oral session in Parliament. But I think there's definitely needed quite a lot more in terms of getting into the specifics concerning the questions posed to him.
The word, or the use of the word patience when referring to the Phala saga, Prof. I don't know what you made of that.
You know, Budvoyo, this Phala issue is in fact like an onion. The more you peel it, the more it stings. Because if you look at the manner in which this whole thing started in 2020 and up to now in 2023, by now we should be having conclusion on this matter. But you recall that just recently the acting public protector released an interim report after 9 months. And then if you juxtapose that with the Section 89 panel, which took only 45 days to produce a detailed report, then you ask yourself questions, is something happening that we are not aware of? And then you look at the other state institutions that are investigating the matter. They are taking too long, and we don't know why that is the case, more especially given public interest in this matter, and also the fact that it affects our president, because whether you like Cyril Ramaphosa or not, the reality of the matter is he is our president. He didn't elect himself, He has his own mistakes, but the reality is that he is our president. So whenever things go wrong in that office, not only his political image is dented, but the image of the country too is dented. So I don't think that all those who are talking about this issue are in fact being aware of the reality and the impact of whatever they say or whatever they don't say on this matter, including, of course, the responses by the Deputy President today, saying that we must be patient. Until when?
Of course, I mean, the DA Chief Whip's question, or one of the questions, but the one on Phala in particular, was around Parliament's role in investigating the president, which of course is another arm of the state, independent of the executive. And the deputy president reply was interesting in the sense that he took it to like how democracy works. If MPs voted in the National Assembly for or against whatever, then that's it. The majority rules, and the ANC is within its right to use its majority whichever way it wants to. Dr. Telepedi.
Well, I do think that's correct in part, and yes, I think one political party can use that numerical strength, but the other part is that, as we've seen in a lot of court judgments, particularly in the Concord, is that MPs must also work in a manner that's reasonable. They must make decidedly decisions that are reasonable. So it is not just to a parliamentary majority that governs in the way that they do. But I just want to say that I think it is true, obviously, that you don't want an instance when a public embarrassment on an issue like Phala comes about, that the first port of call is Parliament or parliamentary committee, an investigation there. I think obviously what should have been done is immediately then see what public protector says, what is SARS saying on the matter, and now we know what they're saying. So obviously if public institutions or state institutions were to drag their feet in the investigation of Phala, then I think it bears on Parliament to intervene in that process by constituting a panel that would obviously call those public institutions to account and give what are the actual reasons or what are the actual issues in the Parliament. Are they legal? Are they foreign policy related? Are they political? And whether the president has transgressed. So to some extent, I think Deputy President is quite correct in saying that let the other processes play its part. And I think in the event that they don't, then I think Parliament has a responsibility to intervene, making sure that those institutions are called to account.
Of course, I mean, the questions went further to the rest of the executive and in his role as the leader of government business. He was, I mean, there were very direct questions from, among others, the chief whip of the official opposition. Let's take a listen to what Siviwe had to say and what the deputy president's response was to her question.
What will you be doing to ensure that perpetual offending ministers are dealt with and face harsh consequences for not fulfilling their roles and they're not answering questions in time?
If members of the executive don't respond to questions, obviously the Speaker has powers to reprimand members who don't comply. And I think the Speaker did it recently. I know that other members felt that was harsh, but it had to be done. And it's going to continue to be done to ensure that the executive is held accountable.
Prof?
You know, Voyo, I'll answer this question, but before I do, there is one point I need to emphasize. That is when politicians are selective when it comes to their relations with the other arms of state, that is the judiciary. When it suits them, they say that the judiciary is independent and therefore it has to be given that space and then in some instances they would say that the judiciary should not interfere in the affairs of parliament. But then when it suits them, they are the first ones to rush to the judiciary to let them decide parliamentary issues. So there is something very interesting there, which we can talk about some other time. But coming to this point, really, yeah, there are a couple of issues that we can discuss in as far as the Deputy President's responses were concerned. In some instances, he was trying basically to say that you have the president, you have the deputy president, and then you have the speaker of the National Assembly. So in the event that ministers don't toe the line, as it were, in other words, they don't respect the constitution by going to parliament to answer questions as they should, then action will be taken. But the reality of the matter is that what politicians say and what they do are two things that are totally different. The promise is quite genuine, and then of course we can take it for now because he has not been the deputy president until he has started recently. But watch the space. When the reality comes, he will be just like any other one before him, whereby they will say one thing and then do the other. In this case, I'm not optimistic that we'll suddenly see ministers honoring their appointment with Parliament to go and answer questions. Of course, I understand that there was a statement made that under a former Deputy President, Titi Mabuza, there was an attempt to try and reduce the number of questions that were left hanging. And then, of course, that was seen to be something on the right trajectory. So we'll wait and see then if the Deputy President will do what he promised he will do. But for me,
what was interesting, Prof, for me was that he didn't quote, the immediate past Deputy President of the ANC. He went as far as Kgalema Motlanthe when he was. When Kgalema Motlanthe was deputy president, and how he would go through, the list of people who would not have appeared before a parliament to account, people who had outstanding questions, and so on, almost saying that he would kind of embarrass them to a point where people took it upon themselves to then comply. But if you look at the record of ministers over the years, the numbers are still high, even though Paul Mashatile, the current deputy president, was saying that number has come back from hundreds to about 83 or 87, can't remember the exact figure now, which is still a very high number. I mean, that shouldn't be a proud record. It's almost like saying we should celebrate stage 2 load shedding.
Absolutely, Putvoyo. And remember that even when he cited former caretaker president, I normally refer to former Kgalema Motlante's caretaker president because he was not elected through the normal channels. So even when he cites him, he's not saying that after he had reported to the leadership of the ANC that Minister X and Minister Y did not honor their appointment with Parliament, then certain actions were taken. There is nothing to that effect. So it's one thing to say that I know how many people did not show up in Parliament, but it's another thing to say, as a result of that, this is the action that we have taken. Until recently, the case is cited of the Speaker having sanctioned some ministers for having not honored their appointment with the Parliament. So looking at things from that vantage point, then I would say that what you are saying was making the right noises, but when it comes to action, it's something totally different altogether, because that action is not followed up by any action by the leadership, including the president or himself as the deputy president. So that's why I'm saying, let's give him the benefit of the doubt and watch the space. But as I say, I'm not optimistic that there will be drastic change just because he's there, because he's been part of the collective anyway.
But then we also know, Dr. Tselapedi, that I mean, from past experience, and this goes all the way. It doesn't only apply to cabinet ministers, but also deputy president and the president at times, that even where they do honor these obligations, they appear before Parliament, oftentimes they don't answer the questions, or they don't answer them adequately or satisfactorily. And a case in point today was, in fact, how the Deputy President himself today evaded the question of whether there was an instruction to ESCOM to stop load shedding ahead of that Monday shutdown.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the nature of politicians either trying to buy time for this or another. Obviously, in this instance, like I said earlier, we are dealing with a Mr. Paul Mashatile, who is known to make careful consideration of his words, to also make sure that his words are in alignment with government programs and what they want to achieve. I mean, I think it is reasonable that ordinary citizens would find it quite coincidental that there was no load shedding during the 3 days, at least leading up to the protest by the EFF. In fact, from the late afternoon to the evening of the day of the protest, electricity kept on shutting on and off for some strange reason, as if they were running out of electricity, at least in my part of South Africa. So obviously I don't think that the ANC would obviously say that they did it deliberately to foil or to limit the impact of the EFF protest, but certainly any keen observer would think that this coincidence was actually orchestrated behind the scenes, as we saw as well with the instances of the buses who were allegedly contacted the night before not to involve or not to transport the protesters across the different provinces. So that's quite interesting. That's quite interesting to see what then I think what the ANC is being able to admit and what they're willing to admit.
Of course, I mean, talking matters about staying with the executive, but more specifically this time, the holding the presidency accountable. And of course, I mean, Paul Mashatile as deputy president is part of that office. IFP MP Singh has some call it his little pet project, where he's been calling for the establishment of a committee to play an oversight role on the executive. Here's how he asked that question, and of course the deputy president's response to that question.
Will you support the creation of a committee to oversee the President Budget Vote 1 here in the National Parliament? Because it's part of accountability and oversight, Honourable Deputy President. Thank you.
I think for now, the mechanisms to hold the President accountable are adequate. I think opposition parties know President can come here to answer questions. So, you know, he's really at your disposal to hold him accountable. I think let's continue that way.
That was an interesting response for me, Prof, for a couple of reasons. One is MP Singh started by saying, Mr. Mashatile, you were once the Premier of Gauteng. And in the provincial legislature, there was a committee that was able to do exactly what we are asking Parliament to do. And if you read that together with some of the things that Mr. Singh himself has said here on this program and elsewhere about why they are insisting on this, and one of them being the fact that the Q&A session, or during the Q&A session, people do get away with literally murder at times, whereas if you are in a closed session, or I mean not necessarily a closed session, if you're in a meeting with a committee that plays that oversight role over your portfolio, you know, everyone gets to answer the question, and if you're not answering it satisfactorily, people can probe, and that can go on for hours. So in other words, saying there is value in having a committee where the president ANC will be called into account, and those sessions, will go deep and wide into issues rather than a Q&A session set up for however short a period, and them having to answer all manner of questions where topics range from, can be where there can be so many issues to discuss at any one time, whereas during those portfolio committee meetings, the agenda is usually narrowed down so that you can really focus on a particular issue or a couple of issues. Prof?
Yes, Budvoyo, you are absolutely right. Maybe let me start off by saying that MP Singh asked a pointed question, straightforward question, and the Deputy President did not answer that question. But if you read between the lines, looking at his statements, he was basically saying that I'm not in a position to answer that question simply because there are already mechanisms in place, so use the already existing mechanism. So in a nutshell, that was implicit in his response.
Well, he did go further. He did say the mechanism we have now is, to use his word, adequate.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm saying that he did not answer the question directly, but then what he did, he basically said that there are already mechanisms in place. I'm not coming up with anything new. That is the point I'm saying. I was reading into his response, that I'm not coming up with anything new. There are already mechanisms in place. And the president, whenever it's time for him to come and answer questions, he comes here. As the current deputy president, I've done exactly that. I'm here, I'm answering the questions. So whether then he answers the questions adequately, that's another story. But then I think that what MP Singh was alluding to was to say, was exactly the point you are making, Vuyo, that if you had a committee whose responsibility would be to hold the president accountable, then you stood a better chance to get to the bottom of the question that you have asked. Because in this case, if you have written questions, sometimes those questions are not repeated when either the president or the deputy president responds. He just reads the responses to question 1 or to question 2, whatever the question was. And in that case, as the general public, we are not privy to the original question, and therefore we might not know exactly how the question was phrased. The only time we know how the question is phrased is when they have these supplementary questions that are asked from the floor. So the reality of the matter then is we'll never get this thing right for as long as we do it this way. But if we're to do it the way that MP Singh is suggesting in a committee, then we're most likely to get better results.
Now, we've spoken about, of course, your impressions about his how he handled his first question and answer session in Parliament, but also, his views on the whole Phala saga that has everything to do with his boss, but also what he will do in his role as the leader of government business to whip those ministers who refuse to account before Parliament, how he is going to whip them or help whip them into line. I want us to talk a little bit about whether we were able to discern from how he answered some of the questions today, what his other role, in other words, what he sees to be, or whether he will perform, perhaps is probably a more appropriate way of putting it, how he will perform in his other roles. Remember, he is also the leader of he heads the National AIDS Council, but he gets given responsibilities from time to time by the president, and a lot of those responsibilities have a lot to do with local government. Now, there was an MP that asked what critical interventions are in place to support a particular municipality, in this instance Kopanong, and others like it. I want us to take a listen to that, and then you can both tell me whether you think he may just be the person to play this particular role perhaps better than his predecessor.
What are the critical interventions required to support Kopano municipality and other municipalities facing similar challenges to be financially viable?
As we go out to deal with service delivery challenges in municipalities, we all have to be cognizant of the fact that we want viable municipalities. So we must assist them to survive long after we are gone. Because it doesn't help to go into the area, you assist people, as soon as you have left, they collapse. So we are looking at long term. When we get there, we're not just saying to Kopanong, okay, now we have resolved the problem of blue water and you supply water and we leave. We must look at what are other challenges that will make this municipality survive. And municipalities don't survive when they don't have an economic base, when they don't have revenue, waiting for national government to give them grants. We must help municipalities to survive, to have an economic base. So we will do that in Kopanong, as we will do in other municipalities.
A part we didn't play there, Prof, was him going further to say he had already sent an advance team, and it was quite emphatic when he got to that point. He went there to say he'll be going there following that team, that advance team that he has sent. And he's not going there for an imbizo. They are there to find out what's going wrong, what's not working. And when he gets there, they'll be talking solutions. And he was quite emphatic. It was interesting for me because if you look, for example, at a municipality like Maluti Apofung, his predecessor, Didi Mabuza, went there several times, sent by the president. But the issues there are still as hectic and all over the place as they were before he actually got there, Prof.
But the problem with our politicians in many instances is that they deal with the symptoms and not the actual cause of the problem. On this one, I think that the Deputy President was on point when saying that whatever solution that you come up with should have a long-term goal. On that one, I fully agree with him. Similarly, when he tackled the issue of rural areas, I'm a rural guy. So I understand exactly what happens in rural areas. And I've made the point that if you want to address overcrowding in urban centers and you are smart, you don't deal with the urban crowding. You first look at the source. So go back to the rural areas and look at the push factors. Why are people running away from rural areas? Address those issues. Once you stop the origin of the problem, only then can you come and address issues in the urban centers. So when the Deputy President was saying that he already has a team, an advanced team, as you put it, that has gone there to get facts from the ground. By the time he arrives there, they will be briefing him, and then possibly they will also come up with the possible solutions, and then those solutions will have to be implemented. I think that is a good approach. It's just on the implementation part then that we'll wait and see. But in principle, I fully agree that the approach that he's taking is the correct one.
From how he handled those local government questions, Dr. Tselapedi, did you get a sense that you're going to get a more involved, more active, more visible deputy president than perhaps his predecessor was?
No, I mean, I got a sense that the deputy president was a bit bland. He was quite generic in his answering. Some of the issues that he gave around local government, I think, are common knowledge to many of us around economic basis of local government, and then how they're able to provide for the basic services given that sort of limited economic base. So I think it's quite generic. I think it's a little bit too late to be detaching teams to look into some of the government failures of whether Kopanong or any other municipality across the country, specifically in your secondary towns and rural towns, really. This situation of deteriorations of towns and infrastructure has been happening for quite a number of years. And for me, I think to be dispatching is either that there is no, obviously, reports on these things, or either the deputy president is not reading those reports, or is just not aware of the issues that are happening in that particular municipality. And I think that's the problem. I think the manner that he's answering questions, and I'll just give one example. The earlier question around, forming a committee that would oversee the presentation of budget in Parliament by the presidency. I mean, I think the deputy president could have just made it clear that there are quite a number of stakeholders that the Treasury and presidency have to interact with before the presentation of budget. It may be indeed the case that there is no need to create another structure on top of these other structures. And obviously, this does not just only include the state or the different departments. It obviously includes people as social partners, economic partners, those outside of government. So I think there's quite an elaborate stakeholder engagement that has to happen before the delivery of budget presentation. And the deputy president should have just brought us into his confidence. But I think there's a sort of lethargic or sort of default position that naturally politicians fall into, which is to give us very sort of generic statements. And I think it shows a lack of appetite over administration of the state or administrating the state, which is, I think, poor on the part of those who are leading in the state or who are leaders of the governing party.
And for you, Prof, did you get a sense that from the way he handled those local government questions in particular, that we were going to see someone, or a deputy president, a lot more visible, a lot more decisive, a lot more present than perhaps Deputy President Didi Mabuza was?
In theory, yes, he painted a picture of someone who's going to be hands-on. But then this is not something like my colleague is saying. This is not something new. We've seen this thing happening since we had our first local government elections in 1996 up to now. That some of these problems are not new. They've been there. So basically, then it means that what the deputy president is saying technically is that I was not there. So don't be surprised then if after President Cyril Ramaphosa exits office and then our Deputy President Paul Mashatile assumes office, then he will start complaining about 10 wasted years, like the current president complained about 9 wasted years. So don't be surprised if that happens, because there is this tendency that if I'm deputizing you, Budvuyo, or I'm deputizing my colleague, Dr. Therapedi, then I don't know anything that happens. I only work on instructions, which is 100% wrong, because you are part of the collective and you take these decisions together, firstly at the party level, and then secondly at a government level. But then suddenly when things go wrong, you claim innocence, you claim that you don't know or you didn't know, now that you're in position. Only now that we are going to act. Those are the things we can expect. Almost, this is the first question and answer session, but you can already read between the lines that come the term when President Ramaphosa leaves office, assuming the ANC will still be in power, then you might expect 9 wasted years or even 10 wasted years, depending on when President Ramaphosa will exit the stage.
Well, this conversation continues after the break when we look at EFF leader Julius Malema's own assessment of their Monday shutdown, which the Red Beret leader presented at a media briefing earlier today. EFF leader Julius Malema says the party will pursue with Parliament the deployment of soldiers to South Africa's streets. About 3,000 SANDF soldiers were deployed to keep the peace during Monday's national shutdown. The EFF called the protests against President Ramaphosa and rolling blackouts.
And are there any...
Government has come under some criticism from some quarters over deploying heavy security to the EFF's national shutdown on Monday. Some have questioned why so many security personnel were deployed to protest, whereas there's a failure to deploy enough authorities to prevent crime. Malema says their party will raise this with Parliament to ensure that the executive is held accountable.
You will know that we are in Parliament and we will be questioning the rationality and the deployment of soldiers and the amount of monies that are going to be spent on the soldiers that are on the streets now. The national shutdown, from its beginning, it was declared to be 1 day. And as to a month deployment, I don't understand what informs that.
Malema said the protest exposed that government has the capacity to provide electricity. He says days before the protest, there was no load shedding, and government used this as a tool to demobilize people from joining the protest.
They were so desperate to keep the lights on to a point that they had potential to collapse the grid. Whatever it takes, let's do it. It doesn't matter, the lights can be off. So it was used as a method to demobilize, which now comes to the point that it is possible to keep the lights on. Someone doesn't want, and the EFF has proved that. 3 days before, look at the results of the EFF.
Malema further declared Monday's national shutdown a resounding success, claiming over 150,000 people participated. Meanwhile, the EFF says they will intensify their efforts to ensure that ultimately President Cyril Ramaphosa resigns from office. Natasha Piri, SABC News, Johannesburg.
I don't know what you, starting with the electricity issue, Prof. I mean, a lot of people have been saying this, that it could not have been a coincidence that we got a reprieve ahead of that and during the shutdown, which we haven't had in a long time.
Yes. Indeed, it has become a discussion point. And I've just penned a piece on that one as well, because I was asking myself the question, if it is true that some generators have been failing in our electricity generation institutions, and if it is true that there have been corrupt activities, if it is true that there have been instances of sabotage, if it is true that all the other things that we've been putting forward as the reasons why we have constant load shedding, if all of these things were true, now the question is, how did it happen that suddenly everything fell into place? Our generators started kicking in, and then corruption disappeared, and then also the third force that we've been talking about disappeared, and then we had no interrupted load shedding, at least for 2 days, Monday and Tuesday. And some people are saying even the weekend there was no load shedding. And then immediately after a Tuesday, then suddenly we're on stage 2, and then we move to stage 3. So that can't be a coincidence. So basically then those who are holding the view that this thing was planned so that at least you try to neutralize this campaign by the EFF, will then say, okay, yes, indeed, we do have electricity now, calm down, let us not fight government. And lastly, something very interesting happened. When Julius Malema was addressing the masses in Pretoria, and then on Human Rights Day, when the president was presenting his keynote address on Human Rights Day, these two read from different scripts. It's like one is reading in Afrikaans, the other one is reading in isiZulu, so they don't hear each other. So Malema was saying that the strike was a success, and among other things, he mentioned this load shedding thing. He said as he was driving to the march, then he heard that load shedding has been suspended. And then on the other hand, the president said, no, this strike organized by EFF was not a success. People ignored the EFF. If that were to be true, how come that we suddenly had a load shedding suspended? Was it not because there was lesser demand because most businesses had closed down, or was it because ESCOM miraculously found its grip and then wanted to prove that in fact we're out of the woods? So those are the questions that are critical at the moment.
Of course, interesting, Dr. Tselapedi, that on the one hand, the EFF leader was he was worried about the stability of the grid, but on the other, patting themselves on the back for delivering so quickly. The EFF works, because if it wasn't for the shutdown, you'd not have had the reprieve.
Sorry about that. I think the most we can do is speculate on the matter. Mm-hmm. I mean, we know that there was a public announcement by ESCOM, I think in January or early February, that around this time, that period of the protest in March, you're going to find that there would be extra energy. So that's on the one hand. But I think what is clear is that the ANC government wanted to make sure that the impact of the EFF's protest would not be as big as they talked about it. For instance, we know that they've put out the security rollout in the manner that they did, whether with the army and the police. We know that they wanted to stop buses transporting protesters. That was clearly also announced. At least there was an interview to that effect where that was officially declared. And we know that the issue of clearly the coincidence of the lack of load shedding of days leading up to the protest seems to be part of the pattern of an attempt by the ANC government to stop the impact of the EFF protest. We can read through that, but at best, I think this will be speculative. We are not technicians at ESCOM, and frankly speaking, I'm not able to speak on the merits of that case. But at least given the optics, it seems to be that those three items that I just talked about right now are quite clear attempts by the ANC government to stop this impact. Because remember, protests are not just boots on the ground, having thousands of people in streets, shutting down businesses. This is a psychological effect on what is possible, especially going into elections. So obviously, this is a campaigning tool for the EFF, and they've begun.
Of course, Prof, I mean, we had the EFF leader there declaring that the 44 members of the EFF in the National Assembly are going to pursue these issues, whether it is seeking answers around why we were able to not have load shedding during those days, but also why so many numbers of security personnel were deployed at a huge cost, he says. In fact, even calls it the looting. It was a way of looting state coffers, and why for such a long period when they had declared that the shutdown was for 1 day only.
For starters, the EFF is within its right as the opposition party to raise those concerns in Parliament, and that is the correct platform to raise those issues, and they are within their rights to do that. And as for the merit of the accusations, let's start with the issue of the deployment of the security personnel. I'm on record saying that I have serious concerns in the manner in which this whole matter was handled. First of all, if you put together all the security personnel, including your police, your SANDF, and even some private companies, I saw some private companies also roaming the streets, as it were, trying to prevent anything that might happen. So the question then becomes, what do you make of people who live in Mpumalanga and people who live in northern part of KwaZulu-Natal, in Umkhanyakude, who have been complaining endlessly about their cars being taken from South Africa to Eswatini and to Mozambique? Whenever they complain about these issues and ask for government assistance, they are told that there are not enough resources. And then suddenly, when the EFF organizes a march, everyone is on board, and then we wonder how much money was used. I saw some choppers flying all over, and then the question is, how much money per chopper did government use? And then you look at the number of the deployed soldiers, then we have the same question, the number of police and so on and so forth. Then the issue of the extension of the stay of these SNDF members on the streets, that one is in fact a more critical issue, because the strike, as Malema said, was going to be for 1 day, and it was never extended. It was for 1 day. So the question then is, on which grounds to then sustain the stay of SNDF on the streets for this long? At whose expense? And if we say we don't have money, where do we suddenly get money to take care of these soldiers who are now roaming the streets? And by the way, lastly, the police are trained to control crowds. Soldiers have two options, either to kill or to get killed. That's how they are trained. If you're a soldier, you have this gun to protect yourself from someone killing you, or you are the one, in fact, executing the killing. So the moment you keep them on the streets for longer, then the next thing that will happen will be cases of people who have fallen victims to the soldiers, like it happened during COVID-19.
Julius Malema also spoke, Dr. Tselapedi, about one of the stories that a lot of people are talking about currently, which is the International Criminal Court issuing a warrant of arrest for Russia's President Vladimir Putin. The EFF leader saying no one is going to arrest President Putin when he visits this country later this year for the BRICS summit.
Of the Rome Statute, we have an international or legal obligation to arrest any person whom that order has been sanctioned against.
Who haven't acted on it in the past.
Well, it's no longer Jacob Zuma presidency right now. We are under Cyril Ramaphosa. I think the reasoning would be quite different with regards to that legal obligation. So I don't think to that extent that a third dominant party or an opposition party would be able to do anything with regards to how then the state responds to that. I think the best thing that the BRICS could do is at least, or rather they have two options. Or South Africa is going to arrest the president, or they're going to host the BRICS summit either in Russia or China. But I don't see how an opposition party is going to do that other than go to court. But they would have to see first what then is going to be government's interventions with regard to effecting that order.
Do you see a Cyril Ramaphosa presidency acting differently, Prof, to a Zuma presidency?
Voyo, luckily, I commented at length when then President al-Bashir came to South Africa. Luckily, Voyo, you know that one of my areas of specialization is international relations. The way international relations operate, if, for example, we have sanctions against former President Mugabe and his cabinet, and then there is a travel ban on them, President Mugabe will still go to address the General Assembly in the US. For the duration of the General Assembly meeting, that space becomes international space. And I made the same point with former President al-Bashir. I was saying that when he came to South Africa, he was not a tourist. Number two, he was not here on a state visit, but he had come here to attend an AU event. So which means for the duration of that event, you cannot then say he's on South African soil. Technically, he's on international soil. So the same applies then to President Putin. So when he comes here, he will not be a tourist and he will not be here on a state visit, but he will be attending a BRICS summit. The only thing then maybe that you can do is to try and intercept him in between. That is between the airport, which is an international space, the BRICS summit venue, which is an international space, and then in between. Then you can maybe have a case. Otherwise, I don't see South Africa, whether it's Ramaphosa or whether it's the late President Mandela or whether it's former President Zuma or former President Mbeki, I don't see them arresting Vladimir Putin.
Well, we've been told that cabinet is going, to discuss this matter. We'll see what comes out of those discussions of the executive. Professor Peggy Mgomezulu, Dr. Thapelo Tselapedi, thanks to both of you for coming on this evening.
Thank you for having us.
That brings us to the end of tonight's show. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Good night.